I want to start this morning by recalling last week. You may remember that I wrapped up that series of messages on the letters of John, John 1, 2, and 3. And I posed a question. What is the greatest danger to your faith in Jesus Christ? And I offered an answer that for most of us, there is not one great danger, but many. From temptations to various types of immorality to spiritual pride. And what can we do about that? And the answer is found in the means of grace, the ways of receiving God's grace, the Word and sacraments. Now, the Scriptures tell us that nothing can separate us from God's love, and the sacraments remind us of God's actions on our behalf. Jesus commanded us to remain faithful to the Word and to His instructions. And so that's why Christians for the last 2,000 years have always studied the Bible and shared Holy Communion. Two primary means of grace. The most central act of Christian worship throughout time and around the world is Holy Communion. Whether it's called the Lord's Supper, Holy Communion, service of the table, the Great Thanksgiving, or Eucharist, you can go to any Christian church around the world today, or if you could transport yourself in a time machine into the past, you could go to any Christian church in the past around the world, and if they were sharing the bread and the cup in the manner that Jesus instructed, you would recognize it as Holy Communion. Now, Jesus never used that term himself, Holy Communion, and yet Holy Communion quickly became the central act of Christian worship. I mean, immediately following his resurrection. Why? Well, it actually goes back to Jesus himself. His actions a firmer foundation for the practice of Holy Communion than his words. St. Paul tells the Christians in Corinth, "For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread." The church, you see, simply imitated the actions of Jesus and obeyed his commandments. The Lord's Supper was not debated or much written about even in the early church. Christians simply experienced the Lord's Supper and through that experienced his presence. It's called a sacrament because it is a specific symbol or a specific sign used to reenact the experience of God's actions. St. Augustine lived from 354 to 430 AD, defined sacrament in a manner that has endured to this day. He wrote, "A sacrament is the visible form of an invisible grace." By the way, you can find that very phrase still in our hymnal today. Somebody asked me after the 8:30 service, where is it? And I clued him in on that. So if you're curious, you can ask me after this service where that is found. Again, he wrote, "A sacrament is the visible form of an invisible grace." So the Lord's Supper has always been the hallmark of Christian worship because it comes from Jesus himself, and it is attested to in Scripture. The Last Supper, of course, is reported in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26, in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 22. And, by the way, if you read the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, beginning at 13th verse, and I encourage you to do that right after this service, your eyes will be opened as you read it, thinking Holy Communion. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, of course, Paul explains to the congregation what communion is all about. Now, scholars say that Mark's words, given right there describing the Last Supper may be the most authentic to Jesus himself. And John's gospel, you look through there, and there is kind of a Last Supper narrative, but it doesn't have any words that Jesus said in a particular order. There's no description of the details of this meal, although it's reported. But if you read the entire Gospel of John, thinking sacrament, Holy Communion, your eyes will be opened up. It's full of imagery of sacrament. Jesus himself, read it in chapter 6, being the bread of life. Then we take a look at Acts chapter 2 and also chapter 20, and then again Paul's letter to the Corinthians. They give us glimpses of the sacred meal in the early Christian churches. And it appears from these reports that there was an entire meal that was part of the celebration. And so maybe the bread and the cup was shared in the midst of that meal or at the end of that meal. But it's what we later called the love feast or the agape meal. It was a common sharing of an entire meal among Christians. However, it was discontinued fairly early on because of abuse of sharing the meal. I mean, things like, Paul writes about it in the Corinthians. People would not bring enough food to share with others, or they'd go sit in a corner and eat their own little meal and not really fellowship. So it defeated the whole purpose. So they did away with the common meal and just had focused on this Last Supper. So what does Holy Communion mean for us today? Well, it actually means the same thing to us that it meant to the very first Christians and to Christians around the world today. It's a remembrance of the Last Supper, Jesus' last meal with his disciples before he went to the cross. And it's a remembrance of that because he wanted them and he wants us to know and to understand just what God was and is doing for his people through these actions. You see, God cares so much for us. Even when we've done wrong things, even when we've behaved poorly, even when we've turned our backs on God, God cares for us so much that he made a sacrifice on our behalf so that we could be reconciled to him and made whole again. And so this action is a sign to us of God's new covenant with us, his people, just as Jesus said at the Last Supper. He said, in the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." The new covenant. Just what did he mean by new covenant? Well, I imagine that many of you are familiar with covenant. I imagine that quite a number of you are in a covenant right now. If you're married or you've ever been married, you've been in a covenant. And I hope you understand that if you're married. And in a covenant, two parties come together in trust and affection for one another. And one party says, I will do this and this and this for you. And the other party says, I will do this and this and this for you. And if one breaks the covenant by not fulfilling those things promised, then there are consequences. In the marriage, there's consequences of broken hearts, broken relationships, and there can be legal consequences as well. Maybe you're not in a marriage. Maybe you live in a homeowners association. We do. It's really a covenant among a large group of people. And the covenant says mostly it says we won't do certain things in order for our neighborhood to continue to be a good place to live. For example, we won't leave our garbage can out on the street 25 hours or more after garbage pickup time. You basically got 24 hours to get your garbage can off the street, okay? We won't leave rusted out, beat up cars up on blocks in our driveway. You know, things like that. And if you don't abide by these agreements of the covenant, which you signed before you bought the house and moved in there, there are consequences. You get a citation from the homeowners association. And then after so many, there are legal consequences that can be brought to bear. So that's what a covenant is about. Parties agree to treat one another, do things for one another in a certain manner, a certain way, or certain things. And so what is this new covenant Jesus is talking about? Well, it actually all started with a covenant originally. Bear with me here. I want to give a little background to this. The Bible tells the story of human origins and what happened after creation. Really, the Christian faith carries the message that answers the questions that are at the deepest level of the human soul. Where did I come from? What am I doing here? And where am I going? And the Bible tells that humans were created by God as thinking beings with free will. And they were also designed for fellowship, that is, communion with God. So God's plan was that we were to live in harmony with Him, in harmony with one another, and in harmony with nature, and that we would want to do so. Now, think about that. Tell them not to land here in this place. Now, think about that. Harmony with God, harmony with one another, harmony with nature. Now, that would be paradise, wouldn't it? So, in a sense, God made a covenant with Adam and Eve, the first humans. They were given the Garden of Paradise, where they would not be plagued by fear of starvation or violence. All theirs if they would simply choose to obey God and walk in fellowship with Him. Unfortunately, they chose to spurn fellowship with God, to try to usurp His place as creator and definer of good and evil. And so there came a great rupture. There were consequences for breaking that covenant. We call it the fall. And it entered into humanity and all of creation, the consequences being sin and brokenness and death. And now Adam and Eve found themselves outside of paradise, living with fear of starvation and violence. They broke this first covenant with God, and God has been seeking to bring humanity back to Him, to the original intent He had in creating us ever since that first rupture. And God has done it through a series of covenants. We don't have time to go through them all. I'll just mention them to you. First with one man, Noah, and then one man and his extended family, Abraham, and then a nation through Moses and the people of Israel. And then finally, the fulfillment of that covenant with the nation was extended to all people in Jesus. It culminated in Him coming to earth to pay the consequences of humanity's rupturing of the covenant by paying for all the sinfulness and then establishing this new covenant. And through Him, we all get a new chance to get right with God and to have the kind of fellowship with Him that He intends for us. Jesus is the new Adam, you see, the new human who chose of his own free will to obey God. And He gives all of us who have screwed up our lives to this point a do-over, this time with Him as our guide and strength to obey God. So, all of that is background to say that our Holy Communion is a reminder that God continues to redeem us from our fallen state, to bring us back to the Garden of Eden, if you will. And this Holy Communion brings us to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. You may remember the story from the Old Testament in Genesis, descendants of Adam and Eve who broke that covenant, Cain and Abel, two brothers. And the story goes that Cain became jealous of his brother Abel and killed him, shed his blood. So that's what the author here of Hebrews is referring to. The blood sprinkled by Jesus is a better word than the blood that comes out of the violence of broken humanity. So, if this new covenant is so important, I mean like of cosmic significance, why did Jesus use bread and wine as a symbol? I mean, why not something bigger and more impressive? I mean, you know, something like a rainbow or something? Oh, did that one already? Okay. Bread has often been called the staff of life, meaning that we depend on it like leaning on a staff to give us the energy to keep on living. Bread was a common, everyday food, still is. And in a time and a region where clean, pure water was not to be found, wine was the everyday drink. In a sense, when Jesus shared the bread and the wine of the Last Supper, he called it his body and blood. In a sense, he was saying, take me as your staff of life. Let me be your food and drink that you take in every day, so that every time you eat and drink, you'll remember to include me in your living. The ordinary things of life found in our everyday lives, that's where Jesus wants us to live in this new covenant. Now, maybe some Sunday I'll have time to go into the other reasons that bread and wine were used because of their deep connection to the history of the people of Israel, and specifically Moses and the Passover. But we don't have time for that this morning. But why do we have communion the way we do it here? There is variation among, remember I said this is the most common form of worship for all Christians around the world throughout time. But there is variation among Christians concerning how the Lord's Supper is administered and how often. Some drink from the cup, some dip bread or a wafer in the cup, others use little individual cups, some remain seated in their seats or their pews, and communion elements are passed along. Some come up to the communion servers and receive it. Excuse me. Much of the variation that we see is due to tradition or local custom, not because of any theological disputes. Interestingly, there's been very little controversy throughout the history of the Christian church over the sacraments. From earliest times, this sacrament was and is usually shared among Christian congregations weekly. And that's still the case in many churches that we know. The Roman Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, many Lutheran churches, and there's probably some others, have communion every week. And that is the custom from the very beginning of the Christian church. So why do we, and why do so many other Methodist churches have communion once a month when it started out as a weekly thing? Well, let me give you a little background, if you'll bear with me. Methodism is the offspring of the Church of England, the Anglican Church, where communion was and still is celebrated, shared every single Sunday. In their earliest inception, the Methodists were not a church. They were societies within the Church of England. They were like the weekly Bible study that the committed folks went to, the more than just Sunday Christians went to. But it was assumed and expected that all of those who went to the Bible study, the small group during the week, would show up at church on Sunday and have communion. Well, things changed in America. Methodists came to America. The Methodist way spread across the frontier, and many of the little groups of Methodists lived a long ways away from any Anglican church or any other church for that matter. And then American independence spurred the Methodists to form their own church. Now you can understand why that would happen. In 1784, after the colonies had gained their independence from England, Methodists didn't want to have England in their name, anywhere associated with their name, as part of the Church of England. So they separated out, became the Methodist Church. But they were still spread across the frontier in little settlements and out in the farms and what have you. And there wasn't enough pastors, Methodist pastors, to go to every little congregation of Methodists. And so what happened is many congregations, say 3 or 4, sometimes 5 congregations shared one pastor. By the way, when this congregation was started, the pastor was from Visalia. And he got here on horseback. So I don't know how long it took him. And I think he probably stopped at Pixley and Early Mart and Delano on the way here. So it could have taken him a month or more to get here. And that's the way it was for a lot of Methodist congregations, so that they had to wait until the pastor showed up before they could have communion. So it became common practice in Methodist churches to have communion once a quarter, 4 times a year. Actually, I think that's the way it was when my parents were growing up, both of them in very rural areas, and I think they had a pastor that came around. In the 1970s, Methodist Church in America, in an attempt to kind of return to the earliest tradition of the church, said, well, we need to do it more than once a quarter, so they moved it up to once a month. And so that's how we got to where we are today, of having communion once a month. Now, in some Christian denominations, the lay people can preside over Holy Communion. And so why does the United Methodist Church require that only clergy preside over communion? Well, in our polity that's contained in this book called A Book of Discipline, it is the responsibility of the pastor to administer the supper of the Lord according to Christ's ordinance. That's the exact words in there. Clergy in the Methodist Church are ordained to word, sacrament, and order. That means to preach and explain the word as contained in Scriptures, to administer the sacraments in the proper manner, and to order the life of church, be organized. Though not expressly forbidden to lay people, the Book of Discipline always infers that pastors preside and lay people are going to assist. So I believe this really stems from the tradition of the Anglican Church, where only clergy did, and also the belief that those who had been officially designated and trained, i.e. the clergy, should be responsible for administering this most central act in the Christian life in a fitting manner, with reverence. The late Thomas Oden, who taught for years at Drew University in New Jersey in the theology school, wrote, "Every Christian pastor is enlisted on behalf of the apostolic tradition to break bread fittingly for the community." So that's why we have clergy in the Methodist Church preside over communion. But what it comes down to, friends, for us, is obedience to Christ's command. John Wesley said this, "Do this in remembrance of me, by which, as the apostles were obliged to bless, break and give the bread to all that joined with them in these holy things. So were all Christians obliged to receive these signs of Christ's body and blood. Jesus never said, remember my birth. Does anybody remember any place in the scriptures where he says to his disciples, okay guys, when I'm gone, don't forget my birthday? Not in there. But he did say to remember his death and to eat the bread and drink the wine in remembrance of me. He also said, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. And so all Christians throughout time and around the world continue to follow his instructions so as they await his coming in final victory over sin and death, and we are fully restored to the original goodness of God's creation. Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. Amen.